So I would like to introduce Gerard Mansour. He is the Commissioner for Senior Victorians and the Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention. And Gerard is a highly respected, passionate advocate for the needs of older people. And in 2013, Mr. Mansour was appointed as the first ever Commissioner for Senior Victorians to provide advice to the Victorian Government on issues relevant to senior Victorians. And in 2016, Mr. Mansour's role was expanded to include acting as the Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention to give older victims of family violence a voice and raising community awareness of elder abuse. So Mr. Mansour's current priorities include isolation and loneliness of older people, prevention and response to elder abuse, and what it means to age well. And his report, Aging Well in a Changing World, was launched in November 2020. So Gerard, I will just share your PowerPoint. Bear with me for 1 second.
While you're doing that, I might just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Yeah, look, thanks very much. We might just go to the first slide there. Thanks for the opportunity to come and chat with you about my recent report. I thought I'd just start by giving you a quick snapshot about my role, and very happy to make this presentation available afterwards, so no need to take any notes. If you want to circulate this, that's fine. So my key role really, when you look at those different tasks, is to give a voice to older people across our state government. So I was appointed into this role about 7 years ago. I'm still the only commissioner of this type where I really have a policy advocacy, community education focus. So I spend a lot of time normally in a COVID normal world. I spend a lot of time out in the community with older people, and like so many, that type of face-to-face work's been constrained in the last year. I spend time providing advice about a whole range of key policy issues. For example, at the moment, there's a review of the Retirement Villages Act, and I'm on the stakeholder reference group and contributing significantly on behalf of the interests and the views of older people. So that's a quick snapshot of my role. But I also, as a result of the Family Violence Royal Commission report, spend some time focusing on prevention of elder abuse, which is another whole piece of work that I do for another day. If we go on to the next slide, thanks. So just before I get to these 8 attributes, I was just going to share with you a little bit of data about my report and a bit of context. So I did this research before COVID hit. So the research was done in October, November 2019, and we had nearly 5,000 responses to an online survey. And we were canvassing the views of older people about what it means to age well. So we looked at a whole lot of the international literature about all the different things that impact on the lives of older people. And I must say that response rate was a really pleasing one. I think it's probably the largest survey response of its kind anywhere in Australia. And even on the world stage, the number of respondents holds up very well. But any online survey, for those of you that have ever done any research of this type, you'll know that there always is a bias. And so in addition to the online survey, I went on a community consultation program with the support of local government, and had older people from a total of 27 different local government areas where I had a chance to speak to many of them face to face. An important part of the consultation process was, in addition to the online, a whole lot of face-to-face. Now, from the online survey, a little bit of the data that you might be interested in, around about 70% of people, of respondents, had quite a positive story to tell about their aging and their life experiences and what it meant to them, and around about 30% less so. Of the people that were less positive, what I can say is that it was the issue of connections with people and their loved ones and what gives their life value is the most significant issue. So 41% said they feel lonely often or some of the time. 1 in 5 have none or little of the love or the friendship that they want. The same sort of number, 22%, have none or little of the enjoyment and pleasure that they want. And again, very similar, about 21% have none or little of the things that make them feel valued. So what it tells us is that there's a substantial number of older people, around about 1 in 5, and if we think of, we've got something like 1.4 million people aged over 60 in Victoria, that's not a small number of people. And bear in mind one thing, because of the bias that I mentioned in online surveys, I've got very little in the way of people aged over 80. So the cohort that we're talking about are traditionally the people that we regarded as more healthy and more well. So if we did that same survey with a wider cohort, I would expect that some of those numbers of negativity might go up somewhat. So one of the key aims of my research was actually to build a profile of how older people themselves see the idea of growing older. And so today I'm going to just quickly go through these 8 attributes and leave it to you if you want to read my report in a bit more detail. And at the end of the presentation, I can show where you can do that. And there's both a summary report and a full report. So if we go on to the next slide, thanks. So I'm just going to quickly touch on each of them. And in my report, for those of you that mightn't have had a chance to look at it yet, I try to embed it in the quotes and the language of older people where they represent a whole lot of views and a whole lot of people. And here's one that really stood out to me. So being able to age well requires having a positive attitude. You need to have a positive attitude to age well. But you need to have acceptance that you'll need help one day. So there's this real balance that people shared with me. On the one hand, not letting yourself be drawn into this negativity, still wanting to explore the world, push the boundaries, but at the same time, balance that with, if we're lucky enough to live long enough, we're probably going to need help one day, and being open to that. And very clearly that came through as a strong message. And you can see the quote there from the risks and barriers. We're so proud and can't ask for help. Some things could be avoided if people asked earlier. And in my report a little bit later on, I talk about what I call the personal waiting list. It became really clear to me that for a number of older people, there's a significant time lapse between when they really know that they've got some concerns and health issues and the time that they're willing to act on that. And from the nature of those deep dive conversations, it struck me that that period of time is actually longer than other waiting lists. And so we often hear about the Commonwealth Home Care program that people can wait, 12 months, 2 years. Often this personal waiting list adds another 2 or 3 or 4 years. So, this is a really significant issue and a significant period of time we're talking about, from when someone's beginning to understand that they need help to the time they act, can actually be a period of 5 or 6 years by the time they come to terms with that themselves and they access services. And I'm sure you see that all the time, and it validates probably what you feel. I know not everybody is like that, but that's certainly one of the significant issues that I identified. If I go to the next slide, thanks. So coupled with this sense of having a positive attitude was the absolutely critical importance of meaning and purpose in life, and how much this changes for people as they go through the journey of aging. The really resilient people, without even, I think, necessarily even thinking about it, find things to occupy and inspire them. And so, it might be that as they get older, they're thinking about the world they're leaving for their grandchildren. And so they're really conscious of, what's happening in that regard. It might be volunteering effort. It might be some other life passion. It could be involved in a local community group, being on a board. So a whole lot of things are the things that drive and give purpose. And it's all about that quote there in a lot of ways. It's about enjoying life and being engaged with life, being involved with community, socializing other people, but it's also about the things that give us passion. You won't be surprised that one of the most powerful things that came through in the meaning and purpose was this second bullet point there, having personal independence and autonomy of decision making. And it's clearly a really significant barrier, for example, to moving into residential aged care much later on. And I would hear people, speak to me in terms of, look, I'm not going to accept any services or support because it's just a slippery slide to eventually one day someone's going to take away my decision making and put me into residential aged care. So that's one of the fears that a lot of people have, is about what happens as they get to that point a bit later in life. But from a positive point of view, having meaning and purpose in life and being able to inspire themselves to do things is a really important part of that. What were some of the risks and barriers? Very interestingly, whilst people I think are getting much better at looking at things like financial plans, so if you talk to a lot of people in their early 60s about the sort of things that are on their mind as they're moving to retirement, I think there's a much better focus now on, say, things like financial planning. I think there's much less attention to other forms of life planning that's really around this central thing of giving their lives meaning and purpose. And there's no doubt that there's a connection between the loss of meaning and purpose and the growth of things like mental health issues. So it stood out as a really important attribute. Another barrier was just finding volunteering. You know, very commonly people were interested in doing things, but they couldn't find a match between the things that interested them and what's available in their community. I can move on to the next slide, thanks. So if you look at the next one issue, it's about be respected and respectful. I'm not sure if that got blocked there. If we could go on to the be respected and respectful slide. Yeah. So this is a really important conversation. I think in a lot of ways, the most important conversation that happened at the tables, and it almost started in the same way. It was, you know, for me in a way, from a social research point of view, I found it quite insightful and amusing in a way that someone would start the conversation, oh, look, you know, we're just not respected in the same way as we were, you know, and they're bemoaning that loss of respect, and very real. But, you know, you could sort of hear this coming through. But after a little while, someone would balance that and say, yeah, but it's also about giving respect as well as receiving respect. And sometimes we're not that good at that ourselves. So there was this real sense of balance that growing older is about both giving and receiving respect. But a really strong part of it was they don't want to be treated like an old person. They don't want to feel that their life stage defines who they are. They want to still be valued and respected as an important member of the community. And from a negative point of view, a lot of people were sort of able to say to me that as they get older, there's a sense that they're not valued in the same way as they were at other points of their life and their life journey. And they use language, they would rarely use the word, say, ageism. That's the sort of word that I've used to describe it. They would describe in two main ways. They sometimes talked about discrimination as a structural sort of thing, but the most common word they use to describe the experience is the last bullet point there on that slide, the word invisibility. There were so many examples of where older people describe the experience of growing older as one of increasing invisibility. And so there's a real sense that there's a stigma that's attached to growing older that they're very aware of. Of course, not everybody experiences that, but it's very clear that this is a key issue for them, is the sense of how well our community is aware of what older people contribute to our society more broadly. If I could go on to the next slide, thanks. I won't spend a lot of time on this one because it's something that you'll all be, you know, hugely aware of, is the critical importance of connections with family, friends, and society, and that's the loss of those, and not just with their immediate family, not just with their children. It's a sense of wanting connections. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting is that the older people get, the more likely it is that their local community takes on an increasingly significant role in their mind. And I think sometimes people's desire to remain in their community is linked with the sense of wanting to age in place in their own home. And I think sometimes when older people are talking about, you know, staying in their own home, what they're really describing is something about their community and their community spirit. It's not necessarily that physical premises. It's a much more emotional attachment to the people that have been a really important part of their life. And a whole lot of challenges that come from that, not least of all, and I did mention just very briefly my role as Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention. One of the things that we do know is the more isolated an older person is, the more risk there is in terms of elder abuse. It is both an indicator or a risk factor, but it's also a consequence. One of the things that perpetrators of abuse will not surprisingly do is try to isolate someone from their support networks in order to make sure that abuse is not disclosed. So if I go on to the next slide, thanks. This is one of the really important things that I learned. So some of the research that I did validated, I've been in this role for nearly 7 years. And so part of the research validated the stories that I'd already heard. This was a really new, strong point that came through. And bear in mind, this occurred before COVID. So before we've just moved into this, increasing experience of moving into a technology-based world. And I've heard a number of people say that really what's just happened is our whole technology base has just jumped forward, 5 to 10 years of development. Now, what older people had to say about this, I think, was really important. And I think there's 3 groups along the continuum for us to think about. The first group are the people that always get very upset if you say to them that older people can't use technology. They may well have been involved in technology for a lot of their life, and they're innovators, and they are just as engaged as technology, if not more so than I am, than any of us are. And so there's this sense of underestimation. Don't assume that because I'm older I can't use technology. I think that's that the first group I've just described and the last group are around about the same size. In the middle, I think, is the largest group. And the largest group are people that are interested in technology. They have some engagement in some form, but it's hugely undervalued and underestimated. They don't have the training and support and skills. It could be cost barriers, but there's this desire to be able to use technology more if there was further support and assistance, and to grow more in that way. And I noticed, and thank you all for the great feedback you provided me when you registered for today, and I've read all those comments, and I think this was one of the ones that came through and certainly validates that what I heard, that a number of older people are actually able to, with training and support, use technology in a way that they haven't had before. And if they get an opportunity to continue to refresh those skills, that's an enormous positive for them about staying in touch with this, the changing world. The final group that I mentioned are the people for whom it's always going to be about alternatives. Technology is always going to be a step too far. And so what are those alternatives like the telephone, telehealth as opposed to video health, and face-to-face connections and communications? And again, you're such a central part in your roles for fulfilling that for so many of this particular cohort of people. And so what does it mean? Well, the people, of course, depending where they are on that continuum, is the degree to which they're able to stay in touch with the changing world. But it's not just about communication. As you can see, it's the challenge of change and resistance to change. We need to work together to help people better understand what it means to grow older and to be assisted through that whole change process and be less fearful. So this critical importance of staying in touch with the changing world is so important for so many older people. I can move on, thanks. Safety and security, again, I'm just going to touch on this at a very high level, but this is where I've got, discussions about aging in place, about the ability to have a home and a place that they want, and the critical connection of that with financial, viability and financial sustainability is so critical. And of course, the barriers, they're often, there's a significant number of people that are currently over 65 who are full pensioners, and for them, cost is a really significant issue, and you would know that. So many times I've heard stories about people balancing whether they have a cup of coffee or they catch a bus to go somewhere. So cost is an enormous barrier, and it's also an enormous barrier for technology that we just spoke about earlier. Having the right hardware, updating their software, having internet connections are all significant parts of the financial challenges that exist. If I could go on to the next one, thanks. And this is a really strong tie. So many of the attributes, as you'll see, tie with the role of reablement, well-being, occupational therapy, and this was, one of the very specific areas. I think one of my biggest learnings in this was the enormous interest of older people about taking as much personal responsibility as they can for health and aging. So the area of health literacy, getting things translated, having an opportunity for people from non-English backgrounds to delve a bit more deeply. People excuse me, from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander background that don't have the same, healthy aging approach, what we need to do in spaces like that. So there were so many areas where the aspiration to obtain health issues was equally tied with their own desire to have a better understanding to maintain their health. This was a really differentiated issue. Some people felt they were doing really well in this space, and some people felt, of course, that they were finding life extremely challenging. And there was such an enormous range of stories along that big continuum, as you'd imagine. And the people for whom it was, I suppose, most challenging were the people that already entered their seniors years, say from age 60, and they already had significant health issues or disabilities, came from, had very poor English. So there's a whole range of key social factors and well-being factors and disability factors that underpin what it means to be able to age well. And then the final of the attributes, again, very closely tied, if I could go on to the next slide, thanks, to the whole issue of being able to get around. And it was two elements. It was the personal mobility and the ability to move around their community. In this part of the conversation, there was also a lot of conversation about community transport. So there's a sense that a lot of our transport systems are designed in the hub and spoke model out of the CBD. So we've got all these sort of networks where, and then there's the desire for buses and other things to connect us across suburbs. But for many people, there was a real challenge in getting to the right place at the right time. It could be accessing specialist medical treatments. It could be just going to their local library, getting to their shopping centre. So often for them, the community transport and the public transport systems didn't necessarily get them to the right place at the point when they weren't, say, able to drive in the way that they could before. And clearly one of the most significant things, and again, it's your bread and butter, is that the fear about loss of mobility is such a significant driver and impact on their well-being, both in terms of the reality of that, but also the fear of that. And you won't be surprised that some of the most significant tie with the issue of independence was the fear of loss of their driver's license. And so the inability to have alternatives, but also going back to that first attribute, part of it's tied to their own attitude. Some people could talk very positively about, before they'd lost their driver's license, they'd found other alternatives. For other people, it was too fearful and scareful, and they weren't scared, and they weren't prepared to even think about that because it was about loss of independence and they couldn't come to terms with that. So if I go to the next slide, thanks. So there's a link there for people if they'd like to access my report. If you just sort of type in Seniors Online and Aging Well report, you'll find it anyway. But there's a link there that can be circulated, and I'm happy I'll put that in the chat in a few minutes' time when I finish. But also, I do have a Facebook presence and a LinkedIn presence. So if anyone's interested in seeing some of the things that I talk about, very happy to have you connect with me in those environments. So I'll finish that slide now. We'll take that down. So look, thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. I think for me that you could see how the attributes all tie together in some way. So whilst there's 8 attributes, there's enormous connections between those attributes, and you'll, very, very clearly as professionals, you'll see a whole lot of things playing out. I think that the times that there are certain points of life around, my final comment around what I call life transition points. I think that for some people, it's when they get to critical life transition points that one or more of those attributes become a fundamental challenge for them. So, for example, the point at which they're moving towards retirement, or the point at which they're facing for the first time a mobility challenge, or the point at which their role is changing. For example, some men spoke about the enormous challenges that they faced when their role in the family changed, and people said, I used to have this role within the family, and now my children tell me what to do. So there's a whole range of things that enormously impact on people's well-being. It isn't just the really obvious ones that necessarily stand out. And so that's the package of 8 attributes that I've developed to give voice to what older people shared with me. So it's not coming from a strictly scientific perspective. The whole purpose of those attributes was to represent the voices and the aspirations of older people themselves. But a lot of people have said to me that it certainly validates a lot of the things that we do know about from a much more strict scientific perspective about what it means to age well. So I'm very happy to have any comments, any questions, but also if you wanted to make any observations about, you know, what it's like for older people now trying to, you know, return to our COVID-safe world, I'd welcome those as well. So thanks for the opportunity to share those thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Fantastic presentation, lots to think about.